welcome to my channel. This is Turnbull's Threads, I believe. And I am your lovely host, Kathy Turnbull, coming to you from southeastern Louisiana. I had a previous intro video up that I actually took on a nice camera, and I found out that my camera was not focusing at all, so we're gonna try it differently this time. We're gonna try use my cell phone and see if this gives me the results that I want for what I'm doing. So obviously I am starting a YouTube channel, mostly because people wanted some tutorials about knitting. So this is going to talk a lot about knitting. I have some other projects going on that you will probably get to see a little bit of, but yes, knitting is going to be kind of the main thing. I hopefully will have another video coming out at the end of this, well, future plans. So mostly today I'm going to talk about some getting started knitting, right? So we'll do a quick getting started, the things you need, and then hopefully the next video will be casting on, talking a little bit about how you go about doing that, and starting a mini project, then the 2 basic stitches of knitting, and then binding off. So a series of videos for the people who have asked me how you knit should end up being, let's see, getting started, casting on, knit purl, bind off. About 5 videos, maybe? Depends on how long I make it, and if I decide to stitch anything together, which, who knows? We'll see. But in addition to that, I plan on talking a little bit about what projects I'm working on. I may talk about if I've bought any yarn in the near future in other videos, but that's for the future, and I don't know exactly what will happen with this. We'll see if anyone actually watches this. So kind of the first thing to talk about with knitting, obviously, is you have to have things, right? You can't knit air. So you need yarn and you need needles. Knitting is the craft that uses the 2 needles. Crocheting uses 1 hook. So if you say knitting, that means you have 2 needles, or a circular needle that has 2 ends. Either way, you have to have 2 things in your hands. So when talking about knitting needles, there's a wide variety available. You have wood ones, metal ones, plastic ones. I think there's some really old bone ones, steel ones, bunch of different types. They're usually they usually come in either 2 types. You'll have either circular or straight needles. So let me show you an example of what I'm talking about. So here I have a really big set of aluminum knitting needles, and these are straight needles because straight. Yes, we're very creative in naming things. So these are straight knitting needles, aluminum, very big. So you would want to use them for a project that uses probably bulky yarn, or a project where you want a lot of space in between your stitches, right? So if you want to make something really close and tight knit, like a really nice non-see-through fabric, unless you're using really big yarn, these are not the knitting needles for you. And likewise, you can have different lengths of straight needles. So let me pull out a couple of needles here. And okay. So I have a variety of knitting needles here, right? I have a plastic and 3 wooden ones, and you can see they are all different sizes, right? There's a big fat one, a more medium one, and then 2 smaller ones. Hopefully that's focusing in the right place. but in addition to being different circumferences, they are also different lengths, right? So this is the longest needle, and these guys are all shorter. So there's a bunch of different reasons why you might want longer or shorter needles. And it's going to depend a lot on your project, right? So your longer needles, say you have a big straight project that you're working on, you'd want longer needles. That way you can fit all your stitches on your needles, right? Because you do eventually run out of room. If you're working on a smaller project though, right, you might want to use the shorter ones because they're a little bit easier to work with, right? You don't have, as you're going down, you don't have as much basically pulling on your hands, which is something that you can have a problem with as a knitter. Like the weight of the material pulling on your hands as you're holding those needles can really cause some pain in this area and like in these fingers as you're doing it. So you do want to keep conscious of these kind of things as you're knitting, right? So if the project is hurting you, you should change something. Knitting is not enjoyable if it hurts you. So I know some people have gloves that help, like if they have arthritis and that's causing them issues. But it may be a needle issue. You might need to switch needles. So if you're using really long straight needles and it's really hurting you, it might be something where instead of using straight needles, you decide to change to a circular needle. So on that note, let's pull out some circular needles. So I have a variety of circular needles here. So it's similar to the other needles in that there are two needles, but instead of being separate and straight, they're all connected by this cord. So the cord can be different lengths. As you can see, I have fairly long cords here, but like this cord just goes on for miles before you get to the other needle. While, let's see, this cord here, right, it's still fairly long, but I get to the end a lot faster. So once again, they come in different types of material, right? You can have wooden ones, you can have metal ones, there are some plastic ones as well, and they can come in different shapes and sizes, right? So these are slightly different sizes, but fairly similar. But say this one, right? This, instead of being a circular one, is a square. So a lot of this ends up being personal preference. So what is most comfortable for you? What feels good in your hands? And depending on your knitting needs, you may like or dislike like bends in the backs of your needles. I personally have a set of interchangeable needles that have bends and I hate them. I never knit with them because the bend in it just really rubs my hands wrong. I can't get comfortable with it, so I don't knit with it. Other people may find that it fits their hand and the way they knit really well. Likewise, there's two different like lengths of knitting needle on this, right? So one is significantly longer needle than the other one. So if you have bigger hands, it might be more comfortable for you to have a larger needle to work with. While if you have smaller hands, you might be more comfortable with the smaller knitting needle sizes. And one of the nice things about interchangeable needles that you don't really have with your straight needles is the fact, or with your circular needles that you don't have with your straight needles, is that there's the option for being interchangeable. So an interchangeable knitting needle or knitting needle set means is that you have a set of cords and you have a set of needles and you can mix and match, right? So if you have a project where you need a really long cord, you can change the size needle for that cord to fit whatever project you're working on. So you can go from a long cord to a short cord depending on what project you're working on. And basically the way it typically works is you have the needle connected to the cord, and you can disconnect it by typically unscrewing. There's some knitting needle sets that will disconnect by like a click, but that allows you the opportunity to switch out sizes, and they don't necessarily have every size. They're I haven't seen really any that get super, super tiny. And likewise, you don't really see any of those really super, super fat ones in the interchangeable knitting sets because most people don't use those sizes. But your typical sizes, you can easily find an interchangeable knitting needle set that will have options for those sizes. They do tend to be pricier, so if you're just starting out and you have the funds to buy one set of knitting needles, don't get an interchangeable knitting needle set because it's a large investment for something that you may or may not enjoy. Make sure that you enjoy it before sinking the money into that. I would say either get a circular needle or a set of straight needles to start out with. Your straight needles, I think, typically are cheaper than your circular needles, but it's going to depend on what project you want to start out with. The nice thing about the interchangeable knitting or the circular knitting needles is that you can work both flat projects and circular projects with them, which means that they can kind of function like a straight needle as well as a circular needle. So if you anticipate that you want to do dishcloths and you want to do a hat and you don't want to buy more than one set of knitting needles to do both those things, go with the circular set. If you only want to do flat things, right, so dishcloths, blankets, things that knit flat, you might want to instead go for straight needles, especially if you're more comfortable with them. So that's one half of the equation, right? Now that we've talked a little bit about the main thing that you need for knitting, one of the main things you need for knitting, the knitting needles, let's talk a little bit about yarn. So once you have your needles, you need something to use with your needles. And yarn comes in a bunch of different materials and sizes and colors, and it can get very overwhelming really fast. So I have some examples to talk a little bit about yarn. So here I have 4 different materials of yarn and 4 different weights of yarn. So let's talk about material first. So knitting yarn can come in many different materials. So this right here, this fluffy thing is it? It's not focusing on it. Okay, come on. Maybe. Whatever. So this is mohair. Mohair is from goat. So it's like goat wool, essentially. And the way they turn it into yarn is they typically have like a silk thread that kind of is the core to help keep the stability together. But this is a very, very thin yarn, you can see. Thin, fluffy yarn, and is typically thought of as soft and shiny and fluffy, so it makes things more fluffy. I also have a acrylic yarn here. So acrylic yarn is something that you can generally find in any craft store. You can find it at Walmart. Found in a shopping place near you. So acrylic is basically a plastic yarn. Yarn made from a plastic material. So there's a bunch of different types. There's a bunch of different weights, a bunch of different colors. The nice thing about acrylic yarn is that it is machine washable. So you don't ever have to worry about, like, especially for baby blankets, right? It's something babies are gonna spit up on their baby blankets or whatever baby clothes they have. So unlike some of your other more natural fibers, acrylic, You throw it in the washing machine, you throw it in the dryer, and it comes out exactly like it was when you put it in. So that's a really nice property of it. They're different feel types, right? So your really cheap acrylic yarns, you can feel kind of how plasticky they are, but some of your nicer acrylic yarns can be really, really soft. So that's nice in that they can be cheap. They're generally cheaper than a lot of your natural fibers are, but you can still get a fairly nice hand feel with most of them. I also have here a silk skein of yarn. So this one, you can tell it's a very thick yarn. So silk yarn is very drapey, right? So unlike wool or some of your other materials that don't they have a little bit more structure to them. Your silk yarns will be very drapey. They also tend to be more expensive than your other yarns, harder to find, especially 100% silk. You can generally find some silk blends with certain other fibers in your local yarn shop. Probably not at Michael's or Joann's or Hobby Lobby. I haven't seen any silk yarn there. But you can easily find it online. It can make some really nice silky material. And then the final, well, I have some other materials here to talk about. So one of your more common ones that you're going to see in a lot of places is cotton. Cotton is a really good one for like dishcloths or things that you would use normal cotton stuff for. And like acrylic, it's really nice in that it is typically machine washable and dryable. It is like other cotton things though, right? So the first time, if you have a garment, the first time you wash it and dry it, you should keep in mind that it can possibly shrink. Which may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. Depends on how well your knitted item is, right? So if it's the perfect size and you don't want it to change size, you're going to want to treat it a little differently that first wash than if it's like a little too big. And then you're like, okay, I can probably get it to the right size by washing it in the machine and going through the drying cycle, because that'll take care of it real well. And likewise, you have linen too. So 2 more plant fibery yarns that are often found and used for knitting. And then finally, kind of the yarn that pretty much everyone thinks of when they think of knitting is wool. So this is a wool yarn. Wool is warm. So if you're in Louisiana from like April to October, it's probably not the knitting material for you. You might want to go with the cotton instead. But the nice thing about wool yarns is that they do a good job of kind of remembering their shape. And you can get some really beautiful sweaters and different things done with like a cotton or a wool. So merino wool is a sheep breed. You can have many different types of sheep breed. A lot of times you'll see superwash versus like natural cotton or natural wool. So natural wool is something that you wouldn't ever want to put in a machine washer or dryer. Because the thing is with your animal fibers, so I'm including mohair in with this, alpaca, anything that's more of a fur animal fiber, you're not going to want to put through the machine washer and dryer because it will felt, which is where all of the different strands, instead of staying nice and separate and you have a like nice pattern and fabric, it's gonna kind of clump together, kind of like your hair, right? Your hair gets tangled, and then in order to get it to go into single strands again, you have to take either a brush or a comb to it and make it look nice again. You can't do that with a knitted fabric because it's already in knots, and it's in specific knots in a specific way, and you can't untangle those knots by running a nice brush or comb through it. So when you put it through the washer and dryer, you make all of the extra things basically not even more together, and it'll shrink your item, and lots of times they end up unwearable. So the only kind of caveat to that is if you get a superwash yarn. So I've seen a couple of them in like Hobby Lobby and Joann's, where the fiber has basically been put through a chemical process so that it behaves a little bit more like your acrylic or your cotton, your plant fiber materials, and that they don't have all of that extra bits that will tangle together and kind of felt together. So you can throw those in the washer. They typically say don't put it through the dryer because that has the potential for felting it, which will then make the item small and hard to wear. And if you're spending a bunch of time in order to make something, you don't really want to do that. So those are kind of some basic different types of yarn. So the next thing to talk about, now that we've talked about the different types of material yarn that you can get, is some of the symbols that you'll see on your yarn. This one's not a great example, but I think this one is better. Yes, this is a good example. So here I have a cotton skein of hand-dyed yarn. So hand-dyed yarn is something that I've been seeing a lot, especially even in our big box stores now, where they create very unique skeins of yarn, and unlike your typical mass-produced solid color yarns, you get a lot of variation in colors that come with that. So this particular skein has some information on the back that is very helpful when figuring out about yarn. So one of the first things you're going to see is it'll generally have this. It'll have a little yarn thing with a number in it, and then it'll say things under there like superfine or bulky or worsted or Aran. So that is actually talking about the weight of the yarn. So it kind of refers to the actual weight and how long of a piece of yarn you get for that weight, right? So in this particular skein of yarn, I have 100 grams of it, and it gives me 432 meters or 472 yards. So that's a fairly large bit. When I compare that with a bulky, so this is a 6 super bulky yarn, right? Comparing the two of them together, my super bulky has the same weight. This is 100 grams, this is 100 grams. This one is almost 500 yards or 432 meters. This is 60 yards. So big difference, right? This is, let's do quick math. 6, 40. This is almost 7 times longer than this is. Same weight, but big difference in how long it is. So typically your lighter weights, you're going to get more, not necessarily more bang for your buck or more length for your weight. Well, you do get more length for your weight, but you get more. You get longer yardage. Depending on your project, right, it'll call for a different weight of yarn. So you do want to look at your pattern and see what the pattern calls for in terms of weight. Likewise, you're going to want to look at your pattern and be like, oh, are they asking for an all wool yarn? Are they asking for an all cotton yarn? There are videos and people who've talked about yarn substitutions. I may eventually talk about it. I've done some, but typically, general advice, especially for beginners, is you don't ever want to substitute a different material and a different weight at the same time, especially if you're just starting out a pattern, right? So you want to try and keep the same weight. So if it says a 4, you want to find a 4. Same thing, if it asks for a cotton yarn, you want to find a cotton yarn and not a wool yarn, because they do behave differently. And they'll look differently. And say you want to make a dishcloth. A wool dishcloth is going to be practically useless. A cotton dishcloth, much more useful. So, like, knowing those, when you're reading your pattern, you're going to want to look at those things and be like, okay, I have wool, I have a wool yarn. It says a 4 here, my yarn says 4 here. So it's the right weight, it's the right material, so that when you actually knit it, it should look like what your final thing ends up being knit as. And ooh, is there other stuff on the back? Oh, yes, some other things to talk about on this while I'm thinking about it. So, maybe. So there's also usually these 2 symbols here, right? So one has a set of knitting needles crossed and one has a crochet hook. And in there, it's also going to tell you what size needles they're using, and it'll give you a gauge swatch size. So you'll see at the top it'll say US 3 or 3 millimeter, so that tells you what size needle to use, right? So they suggest, like, if you want a good, decent, solid woven or knitted bit of material for this, using a US size 3, which in European standards is a 3 millimeter needle. And by using that particular needle, in order to get a 4-inch by 4-inch square knit, you should be using 30 stitches across and 38 rows up and down in a stockinette stitch, which just means it looks like a totally knitted, and that will should give you 4 inches by 4 inches. So they give you gauge because each knitter has kind of their own gauge. When you take yarn and you take your knitting needles and you knit something, typically each knitter is going to have slight variations in how tight or how loose they knit things. So I think I tend to be a little bit on the looser side of knitting. Some people knit really, really tight, which means that, like, your stitches have a little bit more room or they have a little bit less room in between each of them. And depending on if you're a tight knitter or a loose knitter, you can have some difficulties making the pattern fit you if you don't take that into account. So, like, all of your knitting patterns, modern knitting patterns, are going to generally give you a gauge, and they're going to say, using this particular pattern, using these needles with the yarn that you are using, you should be getting a 4-inch use with X amount of stitches across and X number of rows. And by telling you that, you're supposed to then make that square before you decide to knit your project. Public service announcement. Most knitters don't, well, not most knitters, some knitters don't do that. Which can lead to some interesting results down the road. But you, like, if it's something that you're really passionate about, you really should probably gauge swatch, so that you know that your knitting is going to give you the results you're looking for. If you're a loose knitter, you may end up with a garment that's too big. If you're a tight knitter, it might be too small. So you want to actually test out and make sure that you're hitting the right size, so that whenever you actually make the nice big project, instead of wasting a month of knitting work because you didn't check at the beginning and now it's too big, or too small and you can't actually use it, if you take the time to basically put in a couple hours work, test, make sure that your size is the correct size, then you save yourself a lot of time. And then some other information that you typically see on different skeins is they also give you all of the laundry symbols. So what things you can and cannot do. Like this says wash 30 degrees Celsius. So pretty sure that's a cold wash. Could also, could be warm. It is cotton. I would have to look it up. That might be warm. I would have to check. It does have an iron symbol, so you can iron it. It has an X through the circle, so don't tumble dry it. So don't throw it in your dryer. Instead, dry it flat. That's why it has the little square with a line through it. Oh, that's what the triangle is. The triangle is don't bleach it. Advice for most knitted stuff. Don't bleach it. Unless you have a white cotton and you know it's white cotton and it'll be fine with bleach, don't bleach any of your stuff that you knit. It won't turn out well. So most of your yarns will have that information, which will help you in choosing the correct yarn for whatever project you're deciding to work on. So now that I have rambled on for a good while on knitting needles and yarn, join me next time so that I can talk about how to actually cast on things. Yeah, you can tell why this will be more than one video long. So I guess if you enjoyed this, if you want to see more of it, feel free to like, subscribe, comment, etc., etc., etc. If you have any suggestions for other things that you want me to talk about in terms of knitting, like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my projects at some point, and I am going to basically do quick tutorials on some of the basic things that you need to know for knitting, right? So we just covered yarn and knitting needles. Cast on next time. Maybe cast on a knit purl? We shall see. We shall see how much time I have for this. Anyways, if you have any suggestions for videos that you're interested in, things that you want me to talk about, feel free to comment below. Otherwise, have a great day wherever you are, or night. And I guess I hope to see you again in the next episode.